All right, folks, we are right at 3 o'clock. So we're going to get started with the webinar as people continue to come on. Okay, first of all, my name is Emily Knight. I am the manager with the LenFest Ocean Program, and we want to thank you so much for joining us today. We are the funders of the research that you're going to hear about. I imagine many of you have heard of us at this point. I know we've been having these researchers present on this project on a number of occasions now. The project has been going on for the last few years. But for those of you who don't, we are a grant making program based at the Pew Charitable Trust that seeks to fund scientific research and expert working groups that address key ocean and coastal management needs. So all of our projects are scoped with managers and often the input of stakeholders on the research questions and the research design. And then throughout the life of projects, we work with our grantees to communicate the results to the many audiences that can benefit from them. To learn more about us, you can visit our website, lenfestocean.org, and you can also sign up for our newsletter there and follow us on Twitter at lenfestocean, as well as on Facebook. So for today's agenda, we have with us Dr. Charles Green, a professor at Cornell University, Dr. Erin Meyer-Gutbrod, a professor at University of South Carolina, and Dr. Kimberly Davies, a professor at the University of New Brunswick. And they have a new paper out, redefining North Atlantic right whale habitat use patterns under climate change. It just came out on November 1st in the journal Limnology and Oceanography. And my colleague Kayla will drop the link to it in the chat, as well as a blog summary that we put together. This paper is part of a body of work that this research team has led over the last couple of years. And last year, many of you may have joined us for a webinar on their last paper, Ocean Regime Shift is Driving Collapse of the North Atlantic Right Whale Population. And Kayla will drop that in the chat too, as well as a fact sheet that we produced. And while the researchers today will focus largely on the newest paper, they'll also talk holistically about all they've learned about changes in North Atlantic right whale habitat use across their full migratory route and what that means for their ability to adapt going forward. We recognize what a complicated and challenging issue this already is, and that changing ocean conditions really makes it even harder to think about protection of North Atlantic right whales from ship strikes and fishing gear entanglements. But that's exactly why we at LenFest felt that this research was so important to fund. We hope that by shedding light on these changes and research that can begin to explore the many layers of changes in food web and how that affects these animals, that we can help lay the groundwork for management that can keep pace with the rate of ecosystem change, especially given that these animals are going to continue to go to new and old places alike as they try to acclimate. So, in that vein, we want to acknowledge the controversy around the issue. We will do our best to answer all questions that folks have during the Q&A, including how the research can connect to management and policy. That will very much be part of the presentation as well. But we do ask that folks, ask questions that stick to the scope of the project. That is our primary area of expertise, obviously, and we trust your best judgment in doing that. If a question does come up that's beyond the scope, we may not be able to answer it. We may follow up with you, but we will do the best that we can. So on some of the webinar logistics, we have all attendees muted to reduce any feedback or echoes. For questions, we will have the researchers do their full presentation first and then questions at the end. To submit a question, we ask that you type it into the Q&A panel and not the chat. I will try to monitor both. It's just easier to have the questions in one place to keep track of the queue. The other thing is we like to try to reserve the chat for people to share resources. That's where Kayla's dropped links to the papers. And to that end, if you have a related resource that you want to share, feel free to drop it there. And I will read questions aloud for the researchers to answer. And we may not get to them all. We have a lot of folks joining us today. But of course, people can always follow up with us. And otherwise, this webinar is being recorded and we will share the link. So Erin, if you want to go to the next slide. So you can see the speakers here on the screen. And I am now going to turn it over to Chuck to kick us off. So.
Okay, thank you, Emily. Yes, first of all, I want to acknowledge the two young scientists that I worked with. I've had both of them as students. I've known them for over a decade, and they've been tremendous to work with in this project. Next slide, please. This particular paper, we had a lot of additional help with it. I'm not going to go through the whole list of authors, but Kim Davies was able to recruit a lot of people from Fish and Oceans Canada to share their data sets with us. Bob Kenny from Rhode Island, and people from other places as well really contributed and made, this possible. So I want to thank them here. Next slide, please. So this all started during the summer of 2017 when carcasses of North Atlantic right whales started washing up along the shores of the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Next slide, please. Because so many carcasses were observed, NOAA declared it a, let's see, there we go.
Sorry, Chuck, your animation isn't coming through.
I don't think there shouldn't be an animation.
Oh, okay.
NOAA declared an unusual mortality event during summer of 2017. Next slide. And this is because over 14 carcasses were found, which out of a total population of 500 right whales, that means the mortality corresponded to about 2 to 3% of the total population. And as you can see, quite a number of these carcasses are found over quite a widely distributed area in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Next slide, please. So for over 20 years, my lab group has been studying the conservation oceanography of North Atlantic right whales. Next slide. And the primary question we've been addressing is how do climate-associated changes in prey availability affect the recovery of the North Atlantic right whale population? Next slide. Actually, can we go back a slide? Yeah, I'm not sure that it, I think it was supposed to show up here in the corner, but Lenfest, we had been working on this project for 20 years, and Lenfest came in and supported us in the most recent decade. And that has been incredibly important in terms of enabling us to address a situation that we, had not anticipated. It was everything during the decade of between 2010 and 2019 was very different than anything we had observed before in studies that went back to the 1980s. Next slide, please. So for those of you who've been following our research, you're aware that we detected an ecosystem regime shift in 2020. I'm sorry, in 2010. And it was unlike any of the other decadal regime shifts that we had observed going back to the 1980s. The regime shift was associated with a slowing down of the Gulf Stream, and it's potentially linked to a reduction in the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. And that was something that we emphasized quite a bit in the previous paper. What this did is it led to the Gulf Stream beginning to meander closer to the continental shelf. It also led to a northward shift of the Gulf Stream's north wall. We subsequently conducted this regime shift analysis on a number of time series, the Gulf Stream Index, the Regional Slope Water Temperature Index, the Calanus finmarchicus Abundance Index, and the North Atlantic Right Whale Calving Index. And if we look at the top one, you can see in 2010, there was a dramatic northward shift of the Gulf Stream. We see warming slope water temperatures coinciding with that. These are slope waters that are warmed due to an increased contribution of the Gulf Stream to the slope waters. And then those warm slope waters enter into Northeast Channel, into the Gulf of Maine, and also into the deeper basins of the Western Scotian Shelf. Subsequently, we see in the Calanus finmarchicus Abundance Index a dramatic decline at the same time in Calanus, and we also see a dramatic decline in the calving rate of right whales. So what's new about this paper, we started to talk a little bit about changes in the North Atlantic right whales habitat use after 2010 in our last paper. We focused on the increased use of the Gulf of St. Lawrence for foraging, especially during the summertime. And we also talked about the decreased use of most of the traditional Gulf of Maine foraging grounds. And the new paper really goes into much greater detail about habitat use. And now I'm going to turn it over to Erin to describe that.
Thanks, Chuck. Okay, so I'm going to go into some pretty serious detail on the results that we had on this paper that came out this month. So try to hold on for a few minutes. The work that we've done in this most recent paper breaks the right whale habitat down into distinct polygons that are relevant to right whale ecological phases. So this is what those polygons look like in space. We've got the Gulf of Maine here with, Cape Cod Bay, Massachusetts Bay. Down below Cape Cod Bay and of interest is southern New England. And we go all the way up through the various habitats to the southern Gulf of St. Lawrence. We also included this polygon here, which is the Southeast US calving ground that pregnant females and some others that will accompany them migrate to in the winter to give birth. And so what we've done in this paper is we build a distinct model for each one of these polygons and for each month in an annual period to ask the question, has right whale sightings per unit effort changed between this decade and the previous decade for a given polygon for a given month? And we actually do that twice. We do that once comparing the 1990s to the 2000s to say how has seasonal habitat use changed between those two decades. And then we do it again comparing right whale habitat use, so sightings per unit effort between the 2000s and between the 2010s. This is sort of a snapshot of some of the data that we were working with. So here we're looking at right whale sightings per unit effort in each of these different polygons in our northern region. And we're looking at specifically Q2. So those are the months April, May, and June. And on the left-hand panel, we're looking at those right whale sightings in the 2000s for those 3 months, April, May, and June. And in the right-hand panel, we're looking at right whale sightings in the 2010s, also for that period. So you'll see, in the paper, in the supplement, we have a version of this figure made for the 90s, the 2000s, and the 2010s for every quarter. So it's all available. But, I chose to show you this one because there's some clear patterns that pop up. The most obvious is up here in the Gulf of St. Lawrence in the 2000s, there is no effort. So we denote effort either a boat or an airplane has flown over this area and looked for right whales. Effort is denoted by X's. And so there's no effort in the Gulf of St. Lawrence in the 2000s, and of course, no right whale sightings. But in the 2010s, we've got a lot of effort, and we've seen a lot of right whales up in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Then correspondingly, here in the Bay of Fundy, we've had a lot more right whale sightings in the 2000s relative to the 2010s, right? So the story is that some of the right whales that would be using this space in the summer have instead moved up to the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Some other patterns also show up in this particular set of data that I'm showing you, especially here in the Cape Cod Bay area and in the southern New England area. So in the 2010s, there's actually much higher use of Cape Cod Bay and Massachusetts Bay in green just above, as well as southern New England. In the 2010s, right here, we're looking at Q2, so April, May, and June, compared to the 2000s. Okay, so this is what the data looks like that we were using for this paper. But to take, I'm just showing you, I was just showing you one quarter, but we actually did this analysis for every single month for every single habitat. So for the most part in the paper, we showed these results using these heat maps. And you can see on the y-axis, these are those different habitat polygons, and they're ordered roughly from north to south. So, the southern Gulf of St. Lawrence, Bay of Fundy, Roseway Bay, Jeffreys Ledge, Gulf of Maine, Great South Channel, Georges Bank, Massachusetts Bay, Cape Cod Bay, southern New England, and then there's a big gap. But finally at the bottom, you've got the Southeast US calving ground off the coast of Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina. So we've got those habitats on the y-axis. And then on the x-axis, we have month, January, February, March, all the way to December. So anywhere we have a colored box is a place that we had enough data, so right whale sightings data, to compare their use of that polygon for that month between the 2000s and the 2010s. This data is also presented in the paper comparing the 1990s to the 2000s, but I'm not going to show it today in this talk. And so the colors of each box indicate whether or not right whales were more prevalent in the 2000s, and those are our blue boxes, or right whale sightings per unit effort was higher in the 2010s, and those are our red boxes. So here, now that we can see the 2000s versus the 2010s for all habitats for the full span of the year, the main patterns that jump out is that right whales have been using the Bay of Fundy and Roseway Basin less in the 2010s, more in the 2000s, right? So there's been this shift away from these habitats in the late summer and fall months. Down here, looking sort of at the late winter and the spring months, the shift is opposite. So the red boxes indicate that there's higher use of these areas in the 2010s compared to the 2000s. So right whales have been using Cape Cod Bay and Massachusetts Bay, in higher density, but also what we think is striking, for longer in the season, right? So these boxes show up with the darkest colors. They have the black box around the colored square indicates that the Poisson model for this month and this region was significant. And so we see the greatest change in April and May, which tells us that right whales have been using these habitats longer in the season in this recent decade compared to the 2000s. One reason that this could be true is because right whales generally had higher reproductive efficiency in the 2000s. So more females were heading down to the Southeast US calving ground and giving birth. And so these boxes, they're blue, meaning that there was higher use of this area in the 2000s. That color doesn't show up as well because overall the sightings are fewer because there's fewer animals that are using that space, right? It's just a small subset of the population that does that reproductive migration. But we're thinking that it's possible some of those females that instead of reproducing in the 2010s and using that reproductive habitat were instead feeding up here, you know, in the Cape Cod Bay. Oh, so going back a slide again, one thing you may have noticed is we can see, of course, the decline in use of the Bay of Fundy and Roseway Basin in this recent decade, but our models don't really show us a corresponding increase in use in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And the reason we have these blanks here is because, like I showed on the previous slide, there wasn't any survey effort. So we couldn't actually build models comparing the 2000s and the 2010s because we didn't survey in the 2000s. One nice thing that we were able to do for this paper was bring in some data from the Mingan Island cetacean study. And that occurs up here, really far north in the Gulf of St. Lawrence above Anacostia Island. And they would run surveys throughout the summer and fall months looking for rorquals. And they've been doing this consistently and with high survey effort for about the past 40 years. And you know, this is not the area where we think right whales are spending most of their time in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, but it could provide us a little bit of a hint about how right whales have been using this Gulf habitat overall. And so showing the data over here, this bottom plot, we see reasonably high survey effort throughout this 40-year time series. And despite being out on the water almost every day in the summer and fall, these guys in the Mingan Island cetacean study, they didn't start seeing right whales until 2014. They found a couple in the late 90s and the early 2000s. But starting in 2014, the mixed survey saw right whales every single year leading up until now. So even though we didn't have the survey effort in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, this provides some of that reassurance that right whales weren't actually using the Gulf of St. Lawrence, you know, in a high capacity, even though we weren't there to verify it with surveys. The other thing that we did in the study was we looked at zooplankton data corresponding to all of these habitats and these time periods. So we ran very similar models using Ecomon data and using AZMP data. So these black dots on our map shows you all the places that Ecomon net tows were conducted in the time period that we were looking at. So from 1990 to 2019. And then the red dots show the places where the DFO runs consistent zooplankton monitoring surveys. And we use data from both of these to inform why right whales have shifted their habitat use between decades. Notably, when we used the Ecomon data, we were specifically looking at late stage Calanus finmarchicus, which is often thought to be the primary prey group that right whales target. But when we looked at the AZMP data, we also included Calanus hyperboreus. So that's another calanoid copepod that exists higher up in higher latitudes. And so right whales have the opportunity to feed on Calanus hyperboreus when they're up and feeding in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. The survey methods between Ecomon and AZMP are similar. I'm not going to go into the details, but they weren't exactly the same, and so we present the results separately. And so now we're looking at heat maps that show the results of the Ecomon analysis. So looking specifically at late stage Calanus finmarchicus. And here I'm showing both of our decadal comparisons. So on the left, we've got the 1990s versus the 2000s. And on the right, we've got the 2000s versus 2010s. In both of these figures, blue means there's more Calanus in the 2000s. And red means there's more Calanus in the 1990s on the left, or in the 2010s on the right. And that may seem a little bit confusing at first, but what we were trying to do is when we show these figures side by side, you can see that there are a lot of similarities between the 1990s and the 2010s. So when you step back and look at these two heat maps, you just see a lot of blue. And what that indicates is that there was more Calanus finmarchicus in the water in the 2000s relative to the 1990s, for most of these habitats, for all of these quarters. And same is true for the 2000s versus 2010s. There was just more Calanus finmarchicus in the water in the 2000s. And then that abundance declined in this most recent decade. So now we're just looking at the 2000s versus the 2010s. We weren't able to do the 1990s analysis with the AZMP stations because data weren't available. But so we still see, apologies. We still see that the boxes, when we look at these AZMP stations, the boxes are still quite blue, which means that there was more Calanus finmarchicus in the water in 2000s compared to the more recent decade. And there's also more Calanus hyperboreus in the water in the 2000s compared to the most recent decade. These station names refer to Halifax 2, which is here on the Scotian Shelf, Prince 5, which is up in the Bay of Fundy, Rimouski, and Shadiac Valley. Okay, so the only place that we saw an increase in Calanus abundance was at Rimouski, specific for Calanus hyperboreus in the most recent decade, but we don't really believe that right whales are feeding there. So now trying to put everything together, we've got the prey over here on the left, and we've got the right whale sightings here on the right. And so again, we're just looking at the 2000s versus the 2010s. Blue boxes mean more, whether it be more prey on the left or more right whales in the right. Blue boxes mean more of that organism in the 2000s, and red boxes mean more in the 2010s. So we see here in that period I was referring to, sort of the late winter, early spring period, when right whales have begun to use Cape Cod Bay and Massachusetts Bay, in higher densities and for a longer portion of the season in the 2010s. This corresponds to really the only increase in Calanus finmarchicus that we've seen in this recent decade. So it could be that one of the reasons right whales are using this habitat for longer in recent years is because they're targeting this increase in prey availability during Q2, right? During April, May, and June. However, the very obvious decline in right whales that we've seen in the recent decade, in the 2010s, in the Bay of Fundy and in Roseway Basin, it seems very plausible that this decline in right whale use of these habitats corresponds to the decline in Calanus finmarchicus in those habitats. So, here on the left, where we're looking at the prey availability, if you look at Q3 and Q4, there have been, these boxes are blue. There have been declines in late stage Calanus finmarchicus in the Bay of Fundy, and Jeffreys Ledge and Gulf of Maine. And so a strong possibility that right whales have abandoned the high use of this habitat is because they're looking to eat, and when their food availability declined, they decided to go elsewhere. Something that we thought was very striking in the analysis that we did was looking at Calanus finmarchicus and Calanus hyperboreus, which I guess I don't show on this slide, but in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So you still see that Calanus finmarchicus and hyperboreus have declined in Shadiac Valley. So this is the hot spot that right whales have been targeting in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, is Shadiac Valley. And, the copepod abundance is still low in this area compared to what it was in the 2000s, right, in the previous decade. So we think it's notable that the right whales were not leaving the Bay of Fundy and beginning to use the Gulf of St. Lawrence because of some increase in prey availability in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. There wasn't an increase. There's actually a statistically significant decrease in the abundance of this prey. So right whales are really fleeing bad foraging opportunities, and they're trying to make up for it by what is hopefully better foraging opportunities in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, but still not better compared to the previous decade. And this has implications for what we've seen recently with right whale calving, which I think Kim is going to get to right now. So I'm gonna give you over to Kim. She's gonna pull us out of the weeds of all these polygons and all these months and just kind of give us the big story of what's happening with the right whale population.
Thanks, Erin. Thank you. So Erin has very nicely described the major results of the new analysis, and she affectionately refers to this paper as the many models paper, because it involved a very significant synthesis of a lot of information. So I'd like to just take a moment to summarize what this all means in terms of the big picture of right whale health and right whale calving, and also bring in some of the information that we have worked up in other papers that we have published through the LenFest funding mechanism. So first, I want to summarize sort of what these shifts are that we've seen in the Gulf of Maine and what the consequences are, we think, at least what the evidence indicates, to right whales and their births and deaths. So from in the 2000s, our evidence indicates that the waters of the Gulf of Maine were cooler, not just at the surface, but throughout the water column, because the Gulf Stream was further offshore. And this resulted in higher food concentrations, higher Calanus concentrations in this region, good foraging conditions, lots of right whale births, and relatively fewer ship strikes and entanglements compared to the recent decade, because there had been sort of 30 years of science and management that were in place in this region to protect these animals. But in the 2010s, when the Gulf Stream shifted northward, it dumped a lot of heat into the Gulf of Maine. This was not a good condition for Calanus finmarchicus. The food for right whales declined, and this was associated with fewer births and a shift in habitat use to other areas that included areas where there was no yet to be any management measures to protect them, which resulted in more strikes and entanglements. Although since that time, there have now been put into place some of the strongest protection measures for right whales and for any large whale that exists. So this is the main story that our evidence is pointing to. Slide. And we need to always be keeping in mind what the big picture is for North Atlantic right whales. There are less than 400 individuals left in the population, less than 100 breeding females. And what our evidence indicates is that the recovery potential is quite sensitive to the state of the ocean due to the cumulative effects of low population size, prey-dependent calving rates, and impacts from human activities. And so this timeline that you see in the middle figure here shows the number of calves versus the number of carcasses from 2000 to 2019. And you can see the number of calves declining and the number of carcasses increasing. This has caused a shift in the predicted time to extinction, where the extinction and extinction risk, where the extinction risk was low in the 2000s, and now it's to a point where it is quite high. And so this is, the right whales are still not in a good place right now. And although a lot of people are working very hard in order to try to put them back on a road to recovery. Slide. So I want to leave you with a few takeaways. First of all, it's been about 12 years since the last Gulf of Maine regime shift. And our research has indicated that these regime shifts have been occurring approximately decadally since 1980. That doesn't mean that it's going to continue to be decadal, but we need to be nimble and attentive to changing ocean conditions, because we should be expecting more changes, okay? And changing ocean conditions mean that North Atlantic right whales are going to continue to surprise us. And in order for us to be nimble and be responsive, we have to continue with monitoring. Okay, range-wide monitoring efforts are underway, and they need to continue to increase. But we also need to keep recognizing that our monitoring effort and our knowledge of right whale distribution is going to be incomplete for the foreseeable future, even though a lot of people are working on lots of new methods of detection, like satellite detection and lots of other things. And because of this, range-wide conservation is really essential to the recovery of this species. Slide. So this is a slide, a figure taken from Whale Map. I took it off Whale Map yesterday, showing the distribution of survey effort and right whale detections for the last 2 weeks. And what this is really nicely showing is that right whales over the last 2 weeks have been detected in many different places, from the Gulf of St. Lawrence all the way down to Chesapeake Bay. Okay, so right whale detection, there are certain times of year when right whales are really highly dispersed, certain times of year when they tend to be more aggregated. And so we need to be attentive to all of these sort of distributional characteristics and respond accordingly. Slide. And this is the last slide here. So part of monitoring is not only monitoring the whales, but monitoring the oceanographic conditions and the food resource that are impacting these animals. Our knowledge of these regime shifts is extremely important in understanding and predicting where these whales are going to go. So these monitoring programs that we have taken advantage of in this and other studies, the ECOMON survey, Continuous Plankton Recorder, AZMP, are just incredibly important to maintain for this research. And just to leave you with a little tidbit of where we think this is going to go in the future, right whales prior to 2010 were thought to be sort of very strongly tied to Calanus and Marchicus, which is a temperate species. We now know that they can forage on Arctic species of Calanus as well. And so future research on regime shifts is going to get a little more complicated as we begin to deal with the effects of the animals potentially moving further north into the Arctic type waters. Yeah, so that's it for me. Thanks.
And Erin, you can stop sharing your screen now. Thank you. Yeah, so that's the presentation, and we want to jump right into the Q&A. But I want to start off with putting a question to the research team that all of you or any of you can answer, especially given some of the messages that Kim just shared about the importance of being able to track these animals better in real time, the monitoring situation, because there are increasing instances coming to light now of how changing ocean conditions is impacting marine mammals, not just here, but in a lot of places. And so I'm wondering if you guys want to share some sort of take home messages about what the right whale situation illuminates about the challenge of managing marine mammals in a changing ocean going forward. And then we'll get right into the questions that participants are asking.
I'm happy to answer that. Yeah, right whales are one of the best studied species out there, right? I mean, they're so heavily monitored, and it's hard to monitor things that are in the ocean, but still, these guys do a fantastic job, and we've got really great monitoring programs to understand the physical oceanography and changes in the zooplankton that they prey on. So it's this fantastic and fun system to study. And despite all of this effort, and then, we know every whale in the whole species by name, despite that, we really screwed up. We've been watching them. There was a modeling study that came out in 2010, 2011, Ray Gondot and Bograd, and it said that Calanus finmarchicus is going to shift farther north. It said by 2050, definitely by 2100, Calanus finmarchicus is not going to be in the Gulf of Maine anymore. And so, I thought about that paper a lot, years ago, and had all kinds of concerns about how that was going to affect right whales. And despite that, they still kind of changed on a dime, and we didn't see it coming. We were caught unprepared, and thus began the unexpected mortality event that we're in the middle of now. Right whale population was around 500 a decade ago, and now they've been listed as critically endangered. The estimate that came out last month is 340 animals remaining in the species. So, sorry, that was long-winded, but my point is, in this extremely well-studied species with a system that has been thoughtfully modeled in advance, we still were caught unaware, and this mortality event occurred and totally changed the conservation status of the species. So I really hope that everybody else who's thinking about climate change and thinking about their favorite species, and it doesn't have to be a marine mammal, and it doesn't have to be in the ocean, I hope they're looking at right whales and learning from our mistakes and saying, we really need to take our monitoring program seriously. We need to be creative on how we model these changes that are going to occur in the future in response to anthropogenic climate change. And let's be proactive in developing policies so that we're nimble, we're on our toes, and the moment something starts to change, we can respond rather than sort of allowing this conservation crisis to unravel.
I'll put in a comment as well. So I'm on the West Coast now, and all of the same issues that we've seen with North Atlantic right whales are occurring with various whale species here. We're seeing the same issues with entanglement in fishing gear. We're seeing the same issues with ship strikes in the navigation channels into Los Angeles. These are big issues. These are big industries, right? And they don't like to change if they don't have to. So management is really critical here to make sure that we have the ability to know where whales are and when they're there, that we can slow the ships down. That has a tremendous impact on reducing the rate of whales getting struck by ships. The Canadians have done a great job in actually shifting the seasons for their snow crab fishery, which greatly reduces entanglements. The Canadians made a few mistakes, from after 2017, but since, they did a great job in 2018, and then all of a sudden there was another large number of mortalities in 2019, partly because I think there was a lot of pressure from the industries, as well as the thought that perhaps they had a good handle on what the right whales were doing in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And as it turned out, that wasn't the case. And so whales got hit by ships again. But since that time, the Canadians have done a great job managing right whales. I think it's really exciting. I think we've done a lot of good things in protecting right whales in the US, but we definitely have entanglement issues that we need to deal with, especially now that we are seeing the right whales spending more and more time in shallow waters, Cape Cod Bay, Massachusetts Bay, Jeffreys Ledge. So that's a big issue. But the Dungeness crab fishery is a big deal on the West Coast, and entanglement in Dungeness crab gear has really become problematic. And again, the climate's shifting, species are changing their habitat use, and that often brings them into conflict with the human uses of the ocean.
I'm going to jump into the audience Q&A. And the first two questions are from the same person, but I'm going to separate them out because they're somewhat different questions. The first is, how can you compare the data from 2000s and 2010s when the same areas weren't surveyed with the same amount of effort? Wouldn't the results be skewed?
Yeah, that's a really important question, and effort does vary dramatically from polygon to polygon, from month to month, from decade to decade, year to year. So what you're seeing, we call it a little bit cheekily, we call our analyses sightings per unit effort, which is sort of the standard of the trade. So you're not just looking at how many whales did you find in this polygon, for this month. Was it 10? Was it 100? It's how many whales divided by how much effort did you spend looking for them. And so we only included sightings in these models that were on effort. So we have effort data associated with it. And we combine both boat-based effort and aerial effort. So essentially what we're modeling is how many whales per kilometer surveyed by a ship or by a plane did we see. So it's really important. Thank you for the question.
I put it a little bit of a comment here. You basically have to deal with the observations that you have available. Is it the perfect observing system? Absolutely not. But do you then just walk away from it, or do you figure out how can you use the data that are available to say something? And you have to be really careful in what you say and how you interpret those data. But, I think this has been an amazing study, and I can say that because Aaron and Kim get the most credit for it. But bringing together such a diverse number of data sets and putting them together to create a coherent story, is it perfect? No. But it's about the best story that I think we could put together, given all of the different kinds of data that were out there and had never been assembled before.
Yeah, and then the second question from the same person is, and this is interesting to me, how can you isolate the factors impacting the movement of right whales to just prey availability versus human impacts like fisheries, changes in shipping route, noise pollution, etc.?
Yeah, so the short answer is it's beyond the scope of the study because we didn't include any of that data. But I think that it's important data to include. I think right whales probably initially choose where they're spending their time based off of where the foraging is best. But it can change a bit throughout the year, if they're reproducing, if they're mating, and then of course, anthropogenic factors can cause them to leave an area. So it is beyond the scope of the study, but there's a group of people, a paper that's in the process of being published by Enrico Pirota at University of St. Andrews, where he's looking at the effects of multiple stressors. So he's incorporating prey, as well as entanglement, vessel strikes, noise. He's trying to include all of the stressors that can impact right whales. And it gets tricky because the data for some of these anthropogenic stressors is not necessarily great. But look out for that paper. Right now, it's not spatially explicit, but I believe he has the intention of making it spatially explicit in the future. So you can assess changes in their use, between Cape Cod Bay and the Bay of Fundy and the Gulf of St. Lawrence, et cetera.
Yeah, I'll just add that, it's a really important question. It's pretty hard to, figure out what is in a whale's mind when it's making decisions about where to go. But you can use some kind of deductive reasoning to eliminate some of the possibilities in order for right whales to, to migrate from the Southeast US up to Gulf of St. Lawrence. They have to navigate through lots of areas of high and low ship strike risk and fishing gear entanglement risk and noise. And somehow consistently, year after year, they do that and are able to arrive at a foraging ground where they're observed foraging. And so that, there are certainly indications that good indications, I would say strong indications that the search for prey and the need to calve are primary drivers, if not the primary drivers of the large scale migration patterns that we are characterizing in this paper.
And I would just weigh in and just say, we have to remember that correlation does not mean causation. And what we're doing is we're really looking for correlations between the distribution patterns of the prey and the habitat use of the predator in this case. And that's all you can really do. We can't say that the whales are definitely moving because the prey are doing this. It seems like it explains a lot of the variability in the data, but we certainly don't want to exclude the possibility that these other factors could be contributing. And but one of the things when we first started working on this a couple of decades ago, we were looking at how you could just use Calanus abundance to predict the calving rates of right whales. And it was incredible how much of the variability was explained by just looking at the abundance of this one prey species, not necessarily sampled in the best way either. So, again, you're stuck with the observations and the monitoring data that you have available, but the story does hang together. But again, you have to be very cautious in how you interpret it. And share, have caveats, where the uncertainties still lie.
Thank you. And the next question, what is the relationship between the Gulf and food shift and number of calves? I'm assuming that's the Gulf of St. Lawrence and not the Gulf of Maine, but I'm not quite sure. Given they're moving, and that's why I was sort of assuming it means Gulf of St. Lawrence and the food shift and the calves.
Yeah, I'll take that one. That is a very tough question, and we don't have enough years of data yet, I think, to draw any kind of conclusion about the impact that the Gulf of St. Lawrence might be having on the ability of females to get fat enough to carry a pregnancy to term, or the level of social interaction that is needed to to end up producing a calf. That's a very, very, very tough question to answer, and I think it's on a lot of people's minds. The calving has been increasing a little bit over the last couple of years on a bit of an increasing trend, but there aren't enough years yet. They've only been in the Gulf of St. Lawrence since 2015. And they've undergone like really traumatic experiences while there, and lost a lot of individuals from their population, and suffered a lot of entanglement in that area. So we need more years of data before I think there can be any sort of study that quantifies that potential effect. Of course, not all the females go to the Gulf St. Lawrence either, right?
We got clarification from the poster, which is Gulf Stream.
Oh, the Gulf Stream. All right.
So what is the relationship between the Gulf Stream and food shift?
Yeah, I had a slide about that toward the end of the talk. So the Gulf Stream shifting more inshore. It's a water mass that comes up from tropical latitudes, and so it's very warm. It's very warm water, and moving into the Gulf of Maine, it's dumped a lot of warmer water throughout the water column in the Gulf of Maine, and this is correlated with a decline in right whale food. And we don't know the exact mechanism that's led to that decline. It could be a few different mechanisms, but cutting off of supply of Calanus marchicus from more northerly waters, or impacts on overwintering, survival of these copepods. But nonetheless, we do see this relationship between the Gulf Stream meandering and a decline in Calanus finmarchicus in the Gulf of Maine.
Let me make sure that the details are clear to the person that asked the question. So the Gulf Stream and the Labrador Current both contribute to the slope waters. There's an area called the slope water sea that sits between the continental shelf and the Gulf Stream, and that slope water sea has contributions. It's an intermediate water mass. It's not at the surface. It's down at depth, and it has contributions from the Gulf Stream as well as the Labrador Current. Obviously, the Labrador Current's bringing colder and fresher water in, Gulf Stream bringing warmer and saltier water in. What's happened, because the trajectory of the Gulf Stream has changed so that it's beginning its meandering closer to the shelf and it's going further to the north, it's contributing more Gulf Stream water to the slope waters. And so the slope waters are much warmer and saltier than they have been in the previous decades. And it's those slope waters that enter the Gulf of Maine through the Northeast Channel. They also enter in the gullies and other deeper areas that impinge on the Scotian Shelf. So that's where the warm water is coming from. And what's really interesting oceanographically here is that a lot of people have been looking at heat waves occurring in the Gulf of Maine. And I see that there's a question later on about it, so I'll answer it here. So what's exciting about this is in most parts of the ocean where heat waves have been observed, it's usually thought to be due to the heat flux of warm atmosphere over the ocean and the flux through the air-water interface. What appears to be happening here is this warm slope water is coming into the Gulf of Maine and actually preconditioning it so that it is more susceptible to marine heat waves. And that's one of the reasons why the Gulf of Maine has been warming more rapidly than 99% of the world ocean over the last decade.
So we are right at the last minute of this. And so I'm going to put out the last question that we have. We have more questions than that, obviously. Thank you, everybody, to all of your questions. We will download those and share those with the researchers, and we do encourage folks to reach out if you want to. But I will put this forward. Do you have any thoughts on how Southern New England, Nantucket Shoals has become a high-use area especially for winter foraging. Given the reduction of Calanus, can it be assumed that right whales are eating different prey in southern New England? And that'll be our last question.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
don't know the answer to that one. I don't have a good answer for that one. Erin, do you know more about the prey types of southern New England?
well, they could be feeding on younger stage Calanus and Marchicus. They also eat Centropoges and Pseudocalanus in that area. We don't really know what has driven this increased use of southern New England, but a lot of people are working on it right now. So I know there's several projects looking at zooplankton abundances, including throwing nets, near feeding right whales to try and ask this question, what has driven them to this habitat. So really the answer is stay tuned.
I would also say that so the different species of Calanus are really good food. They're packed with lipid. The late stages are packed with lipid. So it's a really good food source, which is probably why you can do such a good job of predicting how well right whales are doing with Calanus as a food source. Doesn't mean that Calanus is the only thing that right whales eat. They clearly eat smaller species, but most of those smaller species are junk food. They don't have a lot of lipid in them. So I'm not sure that they actually contribute a great deal to fattening up the right whales, to enable them to be able to have a successful calving process. So the other food, the other species are there, and right whales are definitely eating them. But how much that contributes to the ultimate reproductive success of the species is I think, questionable.
Well, thank you all. We are just past 4 o'clock, and so we're going to wrap up now. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Reach out to me, eknight at pewtrust.org, if you have any further questions, or reach out to the researchers too. And we thank everyone for joining this. This was really great. Thank you so much, Chuck, Erin, and Kim. This was great. Thank you.
Thanks for
Thanks,
having
Emily.
us.
Thank you for having us. Thanks everyone for attending.